Today, while much of the world is fixated on missiles, troop movements, and battlefield headlines, I believe most observers are missing the deeper story. People are asking whether Iran is winning, whether America is losing, or whether a ground invasion is coming. Those are valid questions, but they are tactical questions. The strategic question is far larger. What matters most right now is not only what is happening inside Iran, but what this conflict is doing to China, to Pakistan, and to the global order the United States constructed after the Second World War. My central argument is simple. If Washington entered this confrontation hoping to weaken China, it may be achieving the opposite. Through overreach, it may be accelerating China's rise as the most influential and respected power in the emerging world system. History has shown this pattern many times. Great powers, convinced of their own permanence, often make decisions that hasten their decline. They confuse military reach with strategic wisdom. They mistake coercion for control. And that may be what we are witnessing now. To understand why, we must first understand China's greatest long-term vulnerability, the Malacca dilemma. For more than 2 decades, Chinese strategists have worried that roughly 80% of China's imported oil passes through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow maritime choke point between Malaysia and Indonesia. This route sits within reach of American naval power. The United States maintains bases and alliances stretching from Singapore to Japan, South Korea, and Guam. In a crisis, Washington could theoretically disrupt this corridor and place enormous pressure on China's economy. For Beijing, this has never been a minor concern. It has been a structural weakness. Now consider what the current war has changed. Iran sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, where a significant share of global oil exports transit. If Tehran can influence access there, then China suddenly gains leverage it did not previously possess. Iran has every reason to favor Chinese shipping because China remained one of its largest energy customers even under sanctions. So while America seeks to contain rivals through pressure, the unintended consequence may be the consolidation of a new Eurasian alignment. China, Iran, and states increasingly skeptical of Western dominance. This is how global orders began to shift, not always through one dramatic battle, but through a chain of miscalculations. So now Iran rewards China, and that changes everything. While Washington believes it is pressuring Tehran, Beijing may be extracting the real advantage. China has spent the last 2 decades searching for ways to reduce dependence on vulnerable maritime choke points. What this conflict may be doing is accelerating that process. If Iran prioritizes Chinese access through Hormuz, then China gains something immensely valuable: a more secure energy corridor and greater resilience against external pressure. In other words, a war intended to constrain rivals may instead be helping one rival solve a strategic weakness that has existed for 20 years. That is no small matter. It is the kind of shift that alters the architecture of power. To understand why, we need to look at how the current world order actually functions. At the center sits American power, military alliances, naval dominance, sanctions capacity, and the ability to project force globally. Around that center sits finance, Wall Street, London, major capital markets, reserve institutions, and the networks that allocate money across the world. Then there is the dollar system itself, the mechanism through which trade, commodities, and sovereign reserves have long operated. Finally, there are international institutions that help legitimize the framework: the UN, WTO, IMF, and others. But every system rests on confidence. Confidence that America can enforce rules. Confidence that its security umbrella is real. Confidence that alignment with Washington remains the safest long-term choice. When that confidence weakens, the structure begins to loosen. If allies perceive inconsistency, hesitation, or strategic overextension, they begin exploring alternatives. They hedge, they diversify relationships, they look east as well as west. And increasingly, many are looking at China. Now let us discuss Pakistan, because Pakistan's role may be one of the most overlooked stories in this entire crisis. Who had the channels to speak with both Washington and Tehran? Who could engage rivals that distrust each other? Not necessarily Europe, not necessarily the UN. Pakistan occupies a rare geopolitical position and has long-standing security ties with Gulf states and historical cooperation with the United States. At the same time, it shares a long border with Iran and cannot afford instability next door. If Iran descends into chaos, Pakistan faces immediate spillover, refugees, militancy, smuggling networks, sectarian pressure, and border insecurity. So Islamabad has incentives to maintain workable relations with both camps simultaneously. That creates something rare in international politics: credibility with opposing sides at the same time. Game theory helps explain this. In a conflict, the most effective mediator is often not the strongest actor, but the actor both sides believe has reasons to prevent escalation. Pakistan fits that role. Iran can trust that Pakistan does not want regional collapse. Washington can trust that Pakistan understands security realities and has long experience dealing with American power structures. And one more fact matters greatly. Pakistan is a nuclear state. That gives it weight, seriousness, and strategic relevance far beyond what many outside observers assume. Sometimes the most important players in a crisis are not the loudest ones. They are the states positioned between blocks, able to speak to everyone while belonging fully to no one. America cannot simply dismiss a nuclear-armed nation of more than 250 million people positioned at the crossroads of Afghanistan, Iran, China, and the Arabian Sea. Geography alone gives Pakistan weight. Demographics, military capacity, and strategic location multiply it. But what makes Pakistan's role especially significant is that it did not merely pass messages between adversaries. It helped shape diplomacy itself. Pakistan could influence timing, tone, sequencing, and framing. It reportedly positioned itself as a venue for talks, facilitated the transfer of proposals, and maintained communication not only with Washington and Tehran, but also with China, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. That is not passive diplomacy. That is active brokerage. And there is an important historical parallel here. In 1971, when the United States sought to open relations with China after decades of hostility, it was Pakistan that provided the bridge. Henry Kissinger's secret trip to Beijing was routed through Islamabad. Pakistan's leadership helped create one of the most consequential diplomatic openings of the Cold War. Without that channel, the strategic triangle between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing may have developed very differently. Now, in 2026, Pakistan appears once again in a familiar role, intermediary between powers unable or unwilling to speak directly. Then it was Washington and Beijing. Today, it may be Washington and Tehran. Some states derive influence from wealth, others from military force. Pakistan often derives influence from position, its ability to remain relevant when rivals need a trusted channel. But why act now? What does Pakistan gain? The answer is straightforward: national interest. Millions of Pakistani workers are employed across Gulf economies, and their remittances are a vital source of foreign exchange. Prolonged regional war threatens labor markets, shipping routes, investor confidence, and family incomes back home. Pakistan is also highly dependent on imported energy. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would raise fuel costs, pressure inflation, and strain an already fragile economy. Then there is the border with Iran. If conflict spirals into state collapse or prolonged disorder, Pakistan would face spillover risks immediately: refugee flows, insurgent movement, sectarian tension, and instability in Baluchistan. So Pakistan has multiple incentives to seek de-escalation quickly. This is precisely why it can be seen as a credible mediator. It is not acting out of sentiment toward one side. It is acting because stability is directly tied to its own survival and prosperity. and mediators driven by clear self-interest are often taken more seriously than those driven by ideology. Now let us return to China, because China's position may be even more consequential. Beijing's strategy has been one of disciplined distance, officially neutral, avoiding direct military involvement, and publicly calling for restraint. Yet neutrality does not mean irrelevance. China can expand influence through trade, diplomacy, energy ties, technology transfers, satellite capabilities, industrial supply chains, and quiet strategic support that stops short of overt confrontation. This is a model of power projection different from the American model, less visible, less dramatic, and often harder to counter. While others absorb the cost of war, China can accumulate advantages, deeper ties with energy producers, greater diplomatic standing in the global south, and the image of a major power gaining influence without firing a shot. That is how some of the largest geopolitical shifts occur, not through battlefield victory, but through patient positioning while others exhaust themselves. This is strategically sophisticated. China can gain many of the advantages of supporting Iran's resistance to American pressure while avoiding many of the direct costs associated with open military involvement. That is a classic great power approach. Influence outcomes without becoming trapped inside the conflict. Second, China has continued purchasing Iranian energy. For Tehran, economic survival has always been central. Years of sanctions constrain access to finance, investment, and export markets. But China remained one of the major buyers of Iranian oil. That relationship gave Iran breathing room when others stepped back. Now, if disruptions in global markets increase demand for discounted supply, the relationship deepens further. Iran needs revenue. China needs energy security. Each side provides something the other values. And these kinds of wartime economic ties often outlast the war itself. Third, and perhaps most important, China can use moments of crisis to present itself as a stabilizing diplomatic actor when others appear inconsistent. Many states expected the United States to manage regional escalation through coherent strategy, clear messaging, and disciplined diplomacy. When signals appear mixed or reactive, space opens for another power to step forward. China often fills that space through process diplomacy, calls with foreign ministers, envoy visits, multilateral statements, coordination with regional powers, and support for ceasefire language centered on stability, shipping access, civilian protection, and international institutions. This style matters. It allows Beijing to appear constructive without carrying the full burdens of military intervention. It also appeals to countries that want order but do not want to choose sides. So imagine the perception shift. America seen as deeply entangled in conflict management, while China is seen as helping calm the crisis without firing a shot. Perception is power in international politics. Now consider the larger historical pattern. Again and again, dominant powers weaken themselves through overextension. They assume superior force can solve structurally complex problems. They enter costly confrontations that drain attention, money, credibility, and political cohesion. Meanwhile, rivals use time to build. Athens, during the Sicilian expedition, is one famous example. Imperial confidence produced strategic disaster while adversaries benefited from Athenian exhaustion. Whether or not modern comparisons are exact, the warning is timeless. A great power can lose relative position not only through defeat, but through distraction. That brings us to infrastructure and long-term order building. China's Belt and Road Initiative is not merely a collection of roads and ports. It is an attempt to redesign connectivity across Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa through trade corridors, logistics nodes, industrial zones, rail systems, pipelines, and financing networks. And in that geography, both Iran and Pakistan matter enormously. Iran links Central Asia, the Gulf, the Caucasus, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Pakistan offers Arabian Sea access and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, connecting Western China to Gwadar Port. For Beijing, these routes reduce dependence on vulnerable maritime choke points and diversify commercial access. Every crisis that reminds countries of supply chain fragility, sanctions exposure, or naval choke points strengthens the appeal of alternative corridors. That is why wars can accelerate projects that were already underway. Now look at the diplomatic symbolism. If China and Pakistan jointly promote ceasefire frameworks or regional dialogue during a major crisis, they are sending a message far beyond the immediate conflict, that new coalitions are capable of managing serious international issues. That does not mean the old order disappears overnight, but it does mean influence is becoming more distributed, more contested, and more multipolar. And that may be the real story of this era. Not one war, but the gradual transition from a world dominated by a single center of power to one shaped by competing networks of power. The UAE is watching, Egypt is watching, Turkey is watching, many states across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia are watching and drawing a similar conclusion. The future is likely to be multipolar. That means no single power sets every rule, controls every corridor, or defines every outcome. Instead, multiple centers of influence compete, cooperate, and balance one another. In such a world, China is increasingly seen as one of those centers. Now, some will object. China has serious problems of its own. Growth pressures, debt concerns, demographic headwinds, the Taiwan issue, domestic constraints. All true. But power in international politics is relative. It is not only about how strong you are in absolute terms, it is about how strong you appear compared with your competitors at a particular moment. And moments matter. If the United States appears overextended, politically divided, strategically inconsistent, or burdened by expensive conflicts, then rivals gain relative space, even if they have flaws of their own. Meanwhile, China can accumulate advantages without direct confrontation. It can deepen access to energy markets, strengthen ties with Pakistan and Gulf states, expand trade corridors, present itself as a supporter of mediation, build influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America by offering infrastructure, financing, and diplomatic engagement. This is a form of soft power mixed with structural power, not tanks crossing borders, but ports, loans, supply chains, technology standards, market access, and the perception that partnership with China can deliver results. In the modern era, many empires are not built only through conquest. They are built through systems people choose to join. That brings us to the larger historical picture. At rare moments, perhaps once every half century or century, the global balance shifts decisively. Old arrangements weaken, new ones emerge. After World War II, Britain was exhausted financially and militarily. The United States rose not by conquering Britain, but by providing what Britain no longer could: capital, security guarantees, industrial scale, and a new institutional order. Today, some analysts argue we are entering another pivot. The United States is not disappearing, and predictions of sudden collapse are often exaggerated. Major powers usually decline gradually, unevenly, and with periods of renewal. But if Washington is perceived as less reliable or less effective, others will search for alternatives. China's opportunity lies there. Not because China is flawless, and not because every country trusts Beijing completely, but because it is offering something many states want: options. Options beyond dependence on one reserve currency. Options beyond one security patron. Options beyond one diplomatic center. And Pakistan's role is especially revealing. Pakistan demonstrated how middle powers connected to multiple blocs can shape outcomes. It has ties to China, relationships in the Muslim world, historical links with the United States, and direct stakes in regional stability. That makes it useful in a multipolar age. States like Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Brazil, and others may become increasingly important, not as subordinates of great powers, but as swing actors able to influence major decisions. So when some say, "Make America great again," they often imagine power as something restored through force alone. But in reality, power is also credibility, coalition building, predictability, and the ability to persuade others to align with you willingly. If a rival is gaining those assets while you are losing them, then the strategic picture is changing. This is not prophecy, it is a framework. We examine incentives, institutions, relative strength, and recurring historical patterns. We ask what trajectory current events suggest if trends continue. And the trend many now see is this: when dominant powers overreach, rivals gain room to rise. When systems lose legitimacy, alternatives become attractive. When the world sees multiple viable centers of power, multipolarity stops being theory and starts becoming reality. History rarely repeats exactly, but it often echoes loudly.